What's up guys, Tony from Tucker Speed. This week's video, we're going to do a recap review of my Road King FXR build. We still, even 5 years after the bike build, get a ton of questions about the bike, what it is, parts that, what parts are on it, modifications that were done to the bike to make it look the way it does. I'm going to give you a history on what the bike started life as, where I got the bike, the things I went through to kind of get it to its current form, stuff like that. Hopefully answer a bunch of those questions before you have to email or message us and ask. But before we do that, remember, like and subscribe. Please, if you have comments or questions, just leave them below. I like the questions. I love to answer questions, especially about bikes that I've built. So just drop those below. So yeah, the bike behind me started life as a 2006 Harley-Davidson Road King Classic. It had just the typical stock, like black cherry paint job, leather saddlebags, had the chrome nacelle up front and everything. I mean, just a basic bone stock Road King Classic, nothing special. We bought it cheap on the auction, and I think I bought the bike back in, 2017, 2018 maybe even before that, honestly. I tore it down to the frame. Didn't really have a direction or idea of what I wanted to do with it at the time. Then we came up with the idea of building a performance bagger, if you will, and some guys are going to debate whether it's a bagger or not because it doesn't have saddlebags, but it is a touring chassis. So we wanted to, we had seen a few bikes out there on Instagram and in magazines and stuff, kind of done up what they call, some guys call it big boy FXRs, turning a Road King or a touring chassis into an FXR looking bike. And at that time, I hadn't really seen anything that I felt like really looked like an FXR to me. Some of the bikes I had seen, they got part of it right, and the other part was kind of just, not right. Or maybe they did the FXRT fairing up front, but they left like the stock saddlebags and rear fenders. So it, like on the back end, it looked like a Road King or a Road Glide. I knew going into the build, I wanted to use really nice components. I wanted to make it a hot rod. I wanted to build the motor. We wanted to do performance brakes, all the stuff that was performance related. And this was probably still pretty early in the performance bagger scene. And I built the bike in end of 2018, first part of 2019, so about 5 years ago now. And I knew going into it, the one thing that I wanted to make look like an FXR was the rear end. Nobody had done the side covers and rear fender the right way, in my opinion. So I ended up cutting the back half of the frame off from behind the triangle back, cutting the fender struts off, rebuilding those, and I actually ended up using a late model Sportster rear fender just because it had that look, that styling, the sport fender, but the width was correct. Early Dynas was too narrow, FXRs were too narrow, later Dynas were too wide, and that late, 04 and newer rubber mounted Sportster fender was just right. It kind of slid right in between the frame and worked out perfect. So Sportster rear fender, and then onto the side covers. There's a couple companies making some aftermarket ones that snap into the stock side cover locations on the touring models. And they were cool and all, but they were big and they were bulky and they stuck out, and they just didn't look FXR to me. So I decided to I worked with a local kind of metalsmith, and we built these things kind of one-off, and those are still probably the #1 requested part on this bike. Everybody asks, where can they get the side covers? And I decided I didn't want to produce them. And one of the big reasons why is everything that's behind the reason the ones that are available are so big and bulky is because there's a bunch of crap behind them. Fuse box, ECM, all the electronics, depending on the year. There's a bunch of stuff behind there that doesn't allow the side covers to sit inside the frame. So I had to, when we modified the frame, we had to basically add mounts on the inside for these to mount to. And then I had to take all of those electronics and move them elsewhere, get them underneath the seat, eliminate them, do all kinds of work. So it just was never going to be a part that I could produce, sell, and you could just buy and snap onto the existing mount points on your touring chassis. So they're one-off, and that's just the way it is. One of the other big steps I did on this bike was the wiring harness. Just for cleanliness, I did, because this bike was a 2006, so it came stock with throttle cables. And just to keep everything on the bars and controls as clean as I could, I didn't want to deal with throttle cables. And just, working with newer bikes that had electronic throttles, I just knew you could make it so much cleaner and nicer if you didn't have to deal with throttle cables. So what I ended up doing is I purchased a wire harness for a 2009 Road King, adapted it to this chassis and drivetrain and motor, and that took a little bit of work. I mean, obviously it took a wire harness, an ECM, a throttle-by-wire throttle body, and all the related parts. Some of the sensors were easily converted over, some of them were not. One of the big ones that I discovered in the build that was kind of a tricky one was speed sensor, because this bike's a 5-speed and the bike that this wire harness came off of was a 6-speed, and where it picks up speed sensor and which gear it's picking it up from is not the same. So that was a little bit tricky to make work, but it was a bunch of money and a ton of work to adapt that wire harness, just for the simple fact that I just didn't want to deal with throttle cables. I just didn't want to see them hanging out there flapping in the wind or trying to tuck them in somewhere. And so I was able to make that happen and keep the controls fairly slim and clean. So those were probably, as far as custom modifications, the two biggest parts of this build. The rear end, the side covers, and the wiring harness were probably the two most challenging and custom pieces of the build. And I really think it set the tone for the rest of the bike. The rest of the bike, as far as motor and suspension and stuff like that, is readily available parts. Starting up front, we went to Kraus. They hooked us up with a KRT inverted front end with Öhlins forks, Brembo calipers front and rear, and I just recently changed to some Kraus isolated risers. I had some different ones on there in the beginning, but swapped those out because I had a set of red handlebars. They were anodized red, and the bars just kind of faded and they were pink, so I had to get rid of them. So I just did new bars and risers about a year ago. Motor is all S&S. A funny story on the motor is I was going to just build it from the bottom end, or not from the bottom end up. I was going to leave the bottom end alone, just put like a 95-inch kit on it, mild cam, and put it together. Had the motor just sitting on the bench at the time, pulled the cylinders off, looked down into the bottom end, and the crank bearing was gone. Pieces of it were laying in the bottom of the crankcase. And so I ended up having to do a crank anyway. So basically got an S&S crank, S&S 98 kit, S&S heads, S&S cam chest, cam plate, oil pump, S&S 585 cams, injectors, bigger throttle body, HPI throttle body, HPI intake, and finished it off with the Two Brothers 2-into-1 pipe. That's kind of where we were at. So we ended up building it from the crank up only because we had to, not because I had originally planned to. I had spent a ton of money on the custom stuff, a ton of money on suspension and brakes, the matching Öhlins rear shocks with that front end. I had spent a pretty penny. In 2018, 2019, we were still early into our shop. We were a few years old, and we hadn't really made a name for ourselves, at least not on a larger national scale yet. So we were really kind of, pulling all stops on the budget on this bike, really. I mean, I had never spent that kind of money when I bought that front end, to be quite honest. I mean, it's crazy because guys do it all the time nowadays, and the money we spend on these baggers is crazy. But for me, back in 2019, I was spending a ton of money on this thing. But the result, I think, trying to stay humble, but I think the bike has gotten a ton of attention. It really kind of catapulted, our name and our shop out there to a lot of people and got a lot of attention. and it's something that I still get phone calls and instant messages and emails about all the time. Finishing off the build, you know, just a few of the finishing pieces. We went with a set of Performance Machine wheels, front and rear. I did 21 up front, 18 rear. Again, some of you are going to argue that 21 is not performance, 19 is the better setup, but I call it performance, so it's performance. So it's my bike, I build it my way. Last thing, you know, just the controls. We have Behringer master cylinders. Oh, that's another thing I did convert from what was stock, is it was a cable clutch bike stock. There again, I wanted the bars to be clean, so I wanted to run a hydraulic clutch, and I ran the Sniper, like really thin hydraulic lines from the Behringer brake and clutch master cylinders, so just to keep everything clean, and then converted to a hydraulic clutch. And mainly just for the simplicity of the controls and keeping everything clean up there. So floorboards, you know, shift peg and brake pedal, just kind of giving it an aggressive look, kind of MX style stuff. And then the FXRT fairing to kind of finish off the FXR look. And then the paint scheme. A lot of people always ask me, like, why is it stock paint? Why didn't you do custom paint job? And what they don't realize is that it was a custom paint job. My buddy John from Raw Tin here in Salt Lake, he actually closed down his shop, but he actually painted it for me. And the reason I went with this paint scheme is because I mean, I'm a sucker. I love like factory paint, and you know, going back through the years of the HD paint schemes. There's so many cool ones, and I just love them. I mean, nothing wrong with some of the crazy wild colors and custom paint jobs, because I have some of those too, but I also love a very simple looking stock paint job at times, and just the cleanliness of the lines and the classic styling. So the reason I chose this paint scheme, because this wasn't stock on the bike I had, is I figured that since I was destroying a Road King by turning it into a FXR, I'll kind of pay homage to the Road King. First year of the Road King was 1994, and it came out with this black and silver paint scheme that I always thought was super cool. So I went with that. We kind of mixed it up. This isn't a true black, it's kind of a charcoal. It's got a little bit of flake in it. And then the silver's a matte finish, which is not the same as the stock version, but just trying to replicate it. John hand did the logo and kind of nailed it perfect to just look like it came right out of the factory that way. And then just kind of blended the lines forward into the fairing and into the fender. And it really just came out perfect. The frame in the sun, the candy powder coat just pops when the sunlight hits it, really shows off. But the paint is very subtle and just clean looking. And you know, I still get tons of guys will take the bikes to shows or whatever and have it sitting in our booth, and people will be, you know, like, nice FXR, man. And that to me is like one of the biggest compliments, because I was trying to make it look like an FXR. So if a guy walks by, and even guys who know bikes have walked up and said, that's a nice FXR. And that's a huge compliment, even though it's not an FXR. It's tricking a lot of people, and so you know, that's kind of cool. So yeah, that's the rundown on this bike. In our video series here, we want to continue to do more bike reviews, whether it's some of the stuff I build or some of the bikes that I do for customers. Before we wrap up, I just want to say thanks to our sponsors of these video series, the Law Tigers. They make these videos happen. They jumped on and have been a huge help to kind of help us get this stuff rolling and videos going. So if you're ever in need, hopefully you're not, but when you are, call the Law Tigers and they'll get you taken care of. Look forward to more videos. Like and subscribe. Drop a comment or a question below, and we'll see you on the next one.